Good afternoon. Good morning for some. My name is Marc Sternberg. I am the Director of Education work at the Walton Family Foundation. Proud to be here today. Proud to be here with Jeb Bush and um, his remarkable team at Excel and Ed. Proud to be here with our next speaker, who I will briefly introduce and welcome him in. A man who honestly needs no or little introduction, Andreas Schleicher, will be joining us, and I'm proud to have this conversation with him. Andreas is the Director for Education and Skills and Special Advisor to the Education Policy, on Education Policy at the OECD. Most notably, for this audience, Andreas directs the work of PISA, which is a remarkably important and informative tool internationally in understanding school effectiveness. So I'm just delighted to have Andreas with us here, and there he is. Welcome, Dr. Schleicher.
Thanks for hosting me.
Why don't we jump right in? I was, you and I have had a few conversations over the last few weeks in preparation for today, and I was able to view, as I hope many of the folks in the audience today were, the video quite provocative, quite a moment we are in. Andreas, I think you would agree. Maybe I could ask, as a starter, for you to share your view of what's at stake in this moment, given the trauma that the system has endured.
Well, every day that is lost in learning is incurring costs to individuals and to our economies, and particularly is hitting those who had least opportunities in education before. I think this crisis has dramatically amplified the many inequalities that we do have in our education system. So it's really key to get young people back to school. And fortunately, around the world, we've seen really good progress on this. I think that's certainly better than what I would have expected. We have sort of learned to coexist with the virus, to have education sort of proceeding still.
Let's try to get precise. And you did this in what you prepared, but I think it's certainly bears repeating, and maybe you'll build on some of the data you shared. How would you quantify the loss?
Well, you can, on average, for a country like the United States, you talk about 3% of lifetime earnings that are already lost, even if everybody is going to go back to school tomorrow. If you add this up for the economy, lower educated people are going to be less productive workers. You add this up over the lifetime working life, that costs the United States about $14 trillion US, over the next 2 generations. I think that's a very, very heavy bill. No?
Yeah. Anything in your vast experience in the field that even comes close to this as an analog, and maybe not globally, but in a country, and maybe if so, what do we learn from those lessons in history?
Well, I think this is about the quality of education. Education systems that do well actually generate a lot of prosperity out of this. Now, our schools today, our economy tomorrow is not very, very complex. And in a way, for the United States, the long trail of poor performing students incurs a dramatic cost for the society, for the economy. And this crisis is just amplifying that. No?
Yeah. And as you look across the globe, I mean, certainly you talked about a few countries, Estonia and Turkey, that have performed admirably, and maybe that was pre-COVID. But where, in this moment, where do you see the shining stars? Where do you see folks coming together, perhaps in a way that others should emulate?
Well, you see, there's a whole range of countries. You look to countries like Sweden that never closed their schools. They closed their supermarkets, their cinemas, but certainly not their schools. You have countries like Japan and Korea that went through a quick crisis, but were very also rapid in moving back to normal, having very good school safety arrangements, getting students, teachers back very quickly. And then there is everything in between. I think there is, so in that sense, I think there's a lot of progress. But what I've also seen is enormous amounts of technological and social innovation in education. This crisis has not just, it has really led people to do things differently. And you're going to see a lot of young people who are going to go back to their teachers saying, well, I learned to learn on my own. I've had access to so amazing digital resources. I've actually learned to learn at my own pace. Why can't we do our lessons differently? And I expect you're going to see a lot of teachers who are going to go back to their principals saying, well, in this crisis, I have advanced. I'm no longer just an instructor. I've also become a really good coach, a really good mentor, a really good facilitator, a good evaluator. Why can't we work differently? So I think that momentum in many education systems will stick. You'll certainly see this in Asia, where this crisis has unleashed a lot of, innovative capacity. China, Japan, Singapore, in Northern Europe as well, where schools have always been sort of social hubs. They have always been sort of very strong centers in communities. And in this crisis, that certainly helps.
Hmm. So, I mean, this is a hopeful note, Andreas. This is sort of an idea that perhaps, for those of us gathered here, and including yourself, who have for a long time wanted big steps forward in how schools work and innovation, and actual pursuit of one of Jeb Bush's favorite things, the BHAGs, the hairy, audacious goals that are moonshots. What I hear you saying is that perhaps this jolt to the system, which we all wish never happened, and we all want to be over as quickly as possible, might actually move us forward. Not a question, more of a reaction to what I hear you saying. Maybe you could just respond.
Yeah, I think so. And, in a way, in the past, we have spent a lot of time and effort to push, new ideas into schools and sometimes old ideas. And I do think what this crisis is sort of encouraging us is to take more effort to find the good ideas in classrooms and do better in scaling and spreading them and to recognize the innovators. I think that's the part of the problem, that we have a very kind of industrial work culture in education, where good ideas in the classroom get lost. Just, you can do an amazing job as a teacher or as a school leader. Very few people around you will know about that. And I think in this crisis, people have established more of a collaborative culture. You see much better interconnections. You see much better collaboration between different stakeholders. You see a move from public versus private to public with private as well. So I think there are encouraging signs. Will it, stick? Will it go to scale? I think these are open questions, and that's probably you're going to find very different answers across the world. But yes, I must say I am hopeful. 2-3 months ago, I was rather pessimistic. But again, the last few months have seen very good developments in many parts of the world. I mean, even, in countries that had a very hard time in education, you look to Colombia or you look to Brazil, and they were very badly hit by the crisis, but then they got back on their feet, using mobile technology, working together with mobile companies to create free broadband provision, getting the publishing industry, on track to actually redesign learning materials very quickly. So I think that is certainly, we have seen perhaps less reform at this time, but certainly more change in education.
Right. We are joined today by several hundred, largely, activists, many of whom are lawmakers, many of whom have jobs to do that are about not just getting the schools open, but then creating the conditions for the kind of innovation you're talking about. So I want to ask you how you would advise them, governors and chiefs of staff and committee members and committee chairs and voting members of state houses. Let me just put in a plug here for a moment. We are in a few moments going to turn to questions from our audience. So I want to encourage those of you with us here to take advantage of this opportunity to submit some questions that we're filtering out, and please do that as we move along. Andreas, what counsel do you have for folks who believe in what you're saying about this being a moment for big progress? What are they to do?
If I were a lawmaker, I would, try whatever I can to enable and encourage innovation at the front line. American teachers teach a lot, but have very little, do relatively little outside the classroom, sort of designing innovative learning environments, building more of a collaborative culture, getting teachers more into research questions. Sort of, I know you pride yourself on being a kind of system of local control, but if you actually look at education through the lens of a teacher or a school leader in the United States, you have so much less room for maneuver at the front line than many of the highest performing education systems. If you go to the Netherlands, 9 out of 10 decisions in every public school are taken at the front line by the people involved, by the communities. In the case of the United States, it's less than 1 in 5 of those decisions. So as a lawmaker, I would take that to heart. How can I, recognize, cherish the good ideas at the front line and mobilize and scale them? The other part is, you need to track progress. I think we will never improve what we cannot make visible. And I think, particularly in this moment where disparities are growing, where inequalities are growing, tracking student learning outcomes systematically, I think, is going to be even more important. And it's not primarily for the purpose of accountability. It's simply to give students better information to learn better, teachers better information to teach better in schools, to become more effective. I do think, that's where regulation law can actually make a big difference.
So you're hitting on a few themes here, and I want to go right to this question of measurement. As you know, as many in the audience know, we are looking at, I would say, my opinion, but a second consecutive school year here in the country of no end of year data collection. I would worry honestly about a third. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. But what I can say with certainty, and I know you'd agree, that there was energy for this kind of movement away from summative assessments for a long time, and we've been worried about this pre-COVID, and COVID has blown it open a bit. But you're saying, hold on, take a special care, and I would expect, especially for the kids who need education the most, to keep those measures in place. And maybe I could ask you to just say a little more of what's at stake if we lose those.
Yeah, not just maybe keep things in place, but also redesign the way in which we measure learning outcomes. I think this data is so fundamental. Otherwise, if students disappear from the radar screen, they will disappear from policy action. They will disappear from pedagogical support. So I think this data is very fundamental. But again, I think in the past, we have seen testing as taking time away from learning, and we need to get over this. We need to make learning and assessment two sides of the same coin. And again, this is where I see so many promising developments technologically. While you study mathematics on a computer, the computer can now study you and find out, where you get bored, where you get interested, where you're very good, where you sort of need to improve. And I think this very artificial division between formative and summative assessment, in the age of technology, it doesn't need to be there. I do think, every part of learning can be part of assessment. And we need to then learn how to harvest those data to feed that information back to our students, to teachers, to parents, so that they can take action. And once again, in this COVID pandemic, a lot more has happened in the last 6 months and in the last 6 years to actually develop really good solutions in a number of countries. So that's where the future is. It's not about, more or less testing. It's about approaching things differently and making sort of the collection of data just an integral part of whatever we do in the field of education. You cannot improve what you cannot see.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry to interrupt you there. That's such an important point. And your point is taken. We have to measure, and we have an opportunity to change how we're measuring. Who does that well? Who does that exceptionally well internationally, and perhaps here in the U.S., who is thinking about it in the most progressive way? And where should the folks on the listening today look for inspiration?
I think you can find plenty of really good examples in the United States as well. They're though mostly localized, and I think that's where the challenge lies. If you want to see, good, AI-based digital assessment systems at scale. Shanghai in China is probably world leaders in this field. They have just made so much progress in this field. And that's also why, in the crisis, they were so quick to get, remote learning up to speed very quickly. But I think their way to track student learning outcomes is just remarkable. And that's also one of the reasons why you have so few underperformers in this system. Whenever, students fall behind, the system does something about it. The system, builds the support, gives teachers the additional resources they need, aligns resources with needs. I think that is what a good assessment system really does. No?
Yeah. You spoke about, I want to read what you said. And this gets to the ideas that you're putting forward about innovation, about moving the system forward. You spoke about, you said learning is not a place, but it is an activity. And that is something that, in your view, we're coming to realize in this moment. What do you mean?
Yeah, I think that's what the corona pandemic has brought home to everyone. I think in this moment, students who had learned how to learn on their own, who had access to good resources, who had, a supportive ecosystem around them, parents and teachers included. For them, maybe this has all been liberating and exciting. But for students who used to be spoon-fed by their teachers, for students who did not have alternative resources, who had no parents, helping and pushing them, this has been devastating. So I think it's really shown us that it's not where you go, but what you do. But I want to add one more point, and I think that's also important. Learning is not just an activity, it's a social activity. We often treat it as a kind of transactional process. And I think what this crisis has really showed us is the importance of that relational aspect. It's this interaction between learner and teacher that is so fundamental. And this is something that, over the last 10, 15 years, we've got lost. It has got lost a bit in our education systems. We've tended to commodify educational experiences. Students became consumers of, canned content. Parents became clients and teachers became service providers. And nobody really took responsibility for learning. And I think we need to change that back to make this everybody's business. And I think that's what this activity is about. It's not, the place of a school or the organization or the structures. It's this process of learning, this very social activity.
I want to explore a tension between these 2 points that I know is manageable, but I think it's worth talking about. On the one hand, school is not a place, it's an activity. And so one could conclude from that, in the spirit of innovation, that it could start to look very different. That we can unbundle it, and we can move to competency-based models, and we can rethink the lived experience of the teacher and the student, and really redefine what a school is. I mean, these are ideas that I hear you saying, that I think this audience has had an energy and excitement for since it started coming together a few decades ago. And so maybe now the crisis is the mother of innovation, and here we are. We're at a moment. You're also saying that that there is an emotional reward for being together, and a need that we have as humans, that our students have. And I should say, I'm seeing this in my own children who are stuck upstairs, certain to come into this room at any moment. Kids are kids, and they need to be with other kids to learn and grow. So do you see the tension that I'm pointing to? And if so, how do you manage that?
Well, you see, if we are, if we want to foster social and emotional competency, this doesn't happen if students sit all in a mechanical way in a classroom and listen to a teacher. That is not social learning. If we are really intentional about creating that social experience, we can connect people in different ways. We can create, project-based learning experiences. We can actually use technology to link up people and teachers, and we can connect the student with the teacher that speaks most to his or her abilities and interests and motivations. So If we wanted to, the point is that our traditional schooling, even though everybody is locked up in one place, it doesn't create that kind of social experience that is so important, at least often not. If you think about American teachers, they teach a class after the class, and they actually spend very little time, because they don't have that time, with students outside the classroom. That's where you learn to know your students. As a great teacher, you need to know your subject, obviously. You need to understand how different students learn that subject differently. But you also need to know your students. And I think if that is the intention, we should redesign learning in a way that this is fostered. If you were coming from the moon, Mark, and you would, develop schooling from scratch, you wouldn't come up with the kind of solutions that we find today. If you
How
were sort of
should,
about
yeah.
creating learners that are imaginative, learners that are social, learners that are, take responsibility, you would design a very different environment to develop those kinds of qualities.
And in fact, I back in a prior lifetime, I started a high school that was, a better version of the mousetrap, but a mousetrap nevertheless. And I think that I hope that I'd have the courage, if I were there today, to think extraordinarily differently about what learning looks like. And maybe that's a question for you. What should it look like? I mean, if we were designing it right now, what are the principles that you would have in mind that should inform the reset that we hope we get to? Well, we'll get to as quickly as we can, and maybe as quickly as the vaccine allows.
Yeah, I think you need to start with the question of what are the knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values that are going to count in the future. The arrival of artificial intelligence pushes us to think much harder of what it means to be human. Now, our current education systems have figured out how to educate, second-class robots. People are very good at repeating what we tell them, but in the future, what makes us human? In the world of artificial intelligence, it's an amazing accelerator, amazing amplifier, but it will require people who can navigate ambiguity, who can make confident decisions, who can distinguish between right and wrong, true and not true. So that, I think, is so important. The capacity to imagine, to create, to build something of intrinsic positive worth, to serve a purpose in our communities, in our societies, to manage tensions and dilemmas. Now, the world is no longer black and white. You need to sort of navigate ambiguity, take responsibility. If that is if that's what we are trying to achieve for the world of today, then we need to think what kind of learning environments will foster that best. And what is clear is that this is not a passive learning environment where students are, just consuming content. It's an active learning environment where students are designers, co-designers of learning environments, and I take a very, very active role where you focus less on the reproduction of subject matter content and more on epistemic understanding. Like, can students think like a scientist? Can they think like an historian? Well, if that's, the instructional environment, you need to think about, what kind of people are going to support that best. And probably you're going to end up with, a much more diverse set of people around those students. Now, then, the ultimate question is, how do we organize this? Now, what's the schooling environment? And also there probably, we need to think a lot more flexibly than just, replicating one industrial structure after the other. But I think that kind of thinking is what this pandemic is inducing. And I think that's very important. We have suddenly seen how our current model of education has got to its limits. You spoke about assessments. Yes, our current testing systems have got to the limits. They can only be applied place-based. They are not, we had to have these very complicated proctored arrangements because we cannot allow people to look up things on Google. Well, I have a very different view about this. I think tomorrow's test should encourage students to look up things on Google. Why would you want to find out whether they can figure this out when they can look at it? You want to see whether they have, thinking and reasoning skills and have the moral maturity to make good decisions. I think that's what modern learning environment.
Yeah. Okay, I want to make it just a note that in about a minute, 2 minutes, we're going to move to questions. So please get your questions in. You are talking about step changes, maybe 2-step changes in how we measure, what we teach, and who does the teaching. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, but on the measurement front, things have advanced really well. I think in 5, 10 years ago, social emotional skills was beyond the reach of metrics. Today, actually, we can, assess creative thinking. In fact, that's going to be the center of the next PISA assessment. I think the measurement side has advanced a lot. We should deploy it rigorously. And then, changing teaching practice is the harder part. I acknowledge this, but for that, teachers will learn best from other teachers. The more we can strengthen the professional autonomy in a collaborative culture, the more we will see the teaching profession advance. The more we keep this as a kind of atomistic, bureaucratic, administrative kind of system, the more we will disempower that kind of teacher creativity now.
And we have seen some remarkable innovations. I was studying, speaking recently with folks in Baltimore, where they've taken the superintendent there, who is a remarkable leader, took her 5 best math teachers and had them teaching not 5 classrooms but 50 classrooms of math. And these are ideas that you'd agree have always been right there, just over the edge of the horizon, that perhaps are now having a moment and are just the beginning. Maybe a last comment from you, and then I'll turn to some questions from our audience.
Yeah, and I don't think it's very difficult. If you go to China these days, they have a digital platform where teachers share their projects, ideas, research plans, and the more other teachers will download your ideas, criticize them, improve them, the more you gain in status. And at the end of the school year, your principal or school leader will not only ask you how well did you teach your own students, but what contribution did you make to the profession? How did you help other teachers advance? What did you do to the careers of others? And I think that raises the status of the teaching profession. That makes them true professionals.
Yeah. So let me jump right into questions. And the first one is from Nicole and picks right up here. I'll read it. There has been a lot of debate among leaders here in the US that in-person education is best and online education is somehow second class. Is that the same mindset in other high-performing countries? How do they ensure quality in both modes?
Well, I would again, say that learning is always a social, a relational process, but it can be greatly facilitated by technology. In-person education doesn't mean, sitting in a classroom. You could have, spend part of your time, when it comes to knowledge transmission, I think technology has become better than teachers. When it gets to coaching, to mentoring, to actually social interaction, that's where the in-person environment is so important. So I think we just have to be a lot more creative. What means of education, what mode of delivery serves what purpose best and what type of student, that is what everybody talks about hybrid learning these days. Now, that is what hybrid learning is about. It's not, dividing students up into groups. You learn with a computer and you learn with a teacher. No, it's about thinking about what kind of knowledge and skills do we develop best with what methodology, and which students are served best with what level of support. And then I think you can use the resources of teachers in a much more creative and effective way. And again, have one teacher teaching millions of students if they're doing a great job on something.
Okay, so that's a question about teachers and how we use technology. Howard Blumenthal has a question about district leadership, and this gets to some of the themes you've hit. Regarding individual learning, as you've noted, the U.S. Decisions seem to be controlled by school districts. How would you imagine a school district moving to pass decision-making to teachers in order to allow students to pursue the kind of individualized path and instruction that you're talking about?
Yeah, as a district, do whatever you can to create an enabling environment. If you are in Finland, for example, school leaders actually spend 2/3 of their time running their school and 1/3 of their time in the school district. So the school district is not an organization of, administrators. Actually, you'll find many school leaders there. They, solve their own problems. They actually create solutions collectively. That also means a school leader knows the other school leaders and they work together every day on this. And I think creating an environment where, the district is very, very closely connected to the schools, and where the district does a lot to actually connect the schools. Now, as a great district leader, don't ask yourself whether schools follow your instructions. Ask yourself, how well do my schools really collaborate? That's the test of truth.
My mentor Joel Klein must have learned that from you. That's quite resonant. Cynthia Floyd's asking a question about that came to mind when I heard you say it as well, about good examples of assessing social and emotional growth and learning.
Yeah, actually, and in fact, at the OECD, we are currently building a global assessment around this. It's probably not yet well suited for anything near a high stakes environment. I would be very cautious that. But if you use it in a low stakes environment, there are many interesting instruments available now. Sometimes they are self-reported, but they are quite robust and reliable. They're also comparable across social contexts, even across countries. So I think the last few years have helped us gain a lot of experience with this. We have also, even in PISA, we have implemented our first assessment of collaborative problem-solving skills. And it was actually amazing. You can see some students who are amazing individual problem solvers and who have great difficulties sharing their ideas, jointly developing ideas, managing a team process. So I think actually assessment is ready for doing this, at least in an environment where the stakes are not too high.
Low stakes, yeah. We've talked a lot about innovation overseas. There's a question from Sam. Do you see international cooperation regarding education innovation? Who is adapting most quickly? You started to answer that question. And where are there bright lights around collaboration?
Yeah, I think actually that is quite encouraging, particularly during the pandemic. Countries have grown a lot closer together because nobody had the magic answers. There's been a lot of collaboration on the goals of education, on curriculum design, curriculum implementation, certainly technology. I think a lot of very meaningful collaboration, some facilitated by organizations like the G20. So I think on the one hand, education is still a field of domestic policy, but you do see, I think, a lot of international collaboration. You can also see the emergence of really global school networks, like the IB schools, which have actually harnessed the richness of, cultural diversity to build world-leading kind of school systems. So I think those developments are also taking place at the level of research. But we could be doing so much more. When you look at the large performance differences that we see around the world, when you look at the accelerating pace that we see in East Asia, when you look at the high degree of equity in education that we see in Northern Europe, where actually the gap between schools, the gap between social groups has become so small. I think this is something that shows to me that there's a lot more that we could be learning from each other. We create so many artificial walls around us. We make us believe, I can't learn from the neighboring teacher. I can't learn from the neighboring school, and certainly not from another country. And I think once you actually probe that, very little of that remains. If we have an open mind, an open heart, I think we can learn a lot from a lot of different people. And we do so in other fields much better than education.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's true. And, it leads to one of the other questions here about how you would advise the Biden administration to engage here, especially in the work of innovation. And I can say it if it's easy. I mean, I have seen our federal government invest quite successfully in innovation outside of education, perhaps brilliantly, but there's a reluctance here domestically to invest in R&D in education, and perhaps you'd comment on that.
Well, look at it this way: the OECD countries spend 17 times as much on medical R&D and innovation than on educational R&D and education, despite the fact that both consume a similar level of public resources. That tells you something. In the medical sector, in 10 months' time, the global community was able to put together a vaccine because people had a common language, because they were able to cooperate, because they had, a common kind of goal. And if we were putting our, ideas and resources together in education, it could make a big difference. And, keep in mind, it's not just about a country like the United States. The education outside your borders may actually matter even more for the future of your country than the education inside your borders. No?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay. Regrettably, I think we're at our last question, but it's an excellent one from Adam. Here is his question. You spent time talking about countries that do a good job of creating a growth mindset among teachers and educators.
Mm-hmm.
What do they do? What are they doing that's special? How do they train their educators to teach a growth mindset? How do you measure the growth mindset?
Yeah, the measurement is easy. We have actually a metric on this in PISA, so we can actually see, and it's actually very strongly correlated with the success of an education system. How you teach it? Well, if you want young people to be creative and to believe in their own abilities, you have to give them room for agency, room to maneuver, room to experiment. If they experiment, they'll take risks. If they take risks, they will make mistakes. If our education systems become really good to help students learn from and with mistakes from and with other students, I think we're going to see more students with a growth mindset. And once again, it's one of the most powerful predictors for the performance on these international assessments like PISA.
Great. Well, I've got another 2 or so hours of questions for you, but I think unfortunately our time has come to an end. Andreas Schleicher, thank you so much for your wisdom, for your time today. And I can speak on behalf of Excel and Ed, certainly, and Walton. We look forward to a deep partnership with you as we all navigate this moment. And I know I say that also on behalf of the many hundreds of folks who are with us today. So thank you very much for your time today and for your wisdom.
Pleasure to work with you, Marc. Thank you.
Great. So a few final remarks as we close. We are on day 3 of EdPalooza and off to a great start, and there's more to come. Next up is our lunch break. So I'm told we have 30 minutes, so go get your food and eat quickly. At 1:45 Eastern, please log back in for your next session. As a final reminder, your login is active for the next 30 days. So please come back and continue to learn from our experts and from each other over the next weeks. We certainly hope you will do that. At the end of the day today, please be on the lookout for a note from Excel and Ed's chairman, Governor Jeb Bush. Thank you again for being with us today, and have a good day.